The first crisis came faster than anyone expected, and it came with violence and fire. The pirate clans had been watching and waiting, and they understood what the galaxy had lost, even if the galaxy did not yet understand it themselves. For decades, human patrol ships had hunted the pirates relentlessly and destroyed their bases and captured their leaders and made piracy unprofitable and dangerous. But now the humans were gone, and the void they left was like an invitation. 3 major pirate clans met in the ruins of an old station near the Galactic Rim, and their leaders divided up the trade routes and planned their attacks, and they were confident because they knew the alien species were not ready. The first attack came in the 3rd week after humanity's departure, and a Velcrin cargo convoy carrying medical supplies was hit by raiders in the outer territories. The Velcrin captain sent an emergency signal and waited for human patrol ships to respond, but no ships came because there were no human ships anymore. The Velcrin tried to fight, but their escort vessels had been designed for deterrence, not combat, and the pirates destroyed 2 escorts and captured 3 cargo ships and killed 17 Velcrin crew members. General Kryn received the report and immediately ordered his fleet to respond, but his ships were slow to mobilize because they had not conducted real combat operations in decades. By the time Velcrin military vessels reached the attack site, the pirates were long gone, and all that remained was debris and distress beacons. Kryn realized with cold clarity that his fleet was unprepared and his crews were inexperienced and his tactics were outdated, and the confidence he had felt during the council vote turned to ash in his mouth. The pirate attacks continued and spread, and within 2 months 12 convoys had been hit, and 4 colonies had been raided, and the death toll climbed into the hundreds. The galactic economy began to contract because merchants were afraid to ship goods and insurance rates skyrocketed, and trade routes that had been safe for 50 years became dangerous. On Theros Prime, the mining operations that Peter Vaughn had optimized began to fail, and the problem started small but cascaded quickly. A primary coolant pump in the main shaft overheated because the Theros engineers did not understand the maintenance cycle, and the pump failed, and the shaft had to be evacuated, and production stopped for 3 days. Veckan read Peter's manual and followed the instructions, but the manual assumed knowledge that Veckan did not have, and he made mistakes that caused more problems. A support beam in Sector 7 collapsed because the stress calculations were wrong, and 5 Theros miners died, and Veckan stood over the wreckage and realized he did not actually understand the systems as well as he had claimed. Production across all Theros mining operations dropped by 60% in the first year, and the Theros economy, which depended on mining exports, went into recession. The Theros government tried to hire human engineers as private contractors, but most humans refused because they were still hurt by the rejection, and those who did agree demanded enormous fees that the Theros could barely afford. The Qualine and Zenith border, which had been peaceful for half a century, erupted in violence over a minor trade dispute. A Qualine merchant ship docked at a Zenith station without proper documentation, and the Zenith authorities impounded the ship, and the Qualine government protested and demanded its return. Without human mediators to facilitate communication, the dispute escalated, and both sides sent military ships, and harsh words were exchanged, and old grievances surfaced. A Zenithi patrol captain made a decision that in hindsight was clearly wrong, and fired warning shots across the bow of a Qualine military vessel, and the Qualine captain interpreted this as an attack and returned fire. Within hours, a full battle was underway, and both sides called for reinforcements, and thousands of soldiers died in the first engagement. The Galactic Council tried to negotiate a ceasefire, but without skilled mediators, the talks went nowhere, and both sides accused the other of bad faith, and the war spread to 3 border systems. Claire Dixon watched the news reports from her apartment on Earth and felt sick because she knew she could have prevented this, and she knew that dozens of human mediators could have resolved the dispute in days. All across the galaxy, similar problems emerged, and the systems that humanity had built and maintained began to break down. The trade network became fragmented because the complex algorithms that balanced supply and demand required constant adjustment, and the alien administrators did not understand the underlying principles. Medical centers struggled because treatments that combined knowledge from multiple species required coordination that no single species could provide alone. Agricultural systems failed because the carefully balanced ecosystems that human scientists had designed were more fragile than anyone realized. The galactic economy contracted by 30% in the first year, and unemployment rose and species that had been prosperous began to struggle. In the great amphitheater on Zenithia, the Galactic Council met in emergency session, and Council Leader Threevax looked older and more tired than ever. Delegates shouted accusations at each other and blamed their neighbors for the crisis, and the unity that had seemed so strong during the vote to expel humanity crumbled under pressure. Some delegates suggested asking Earth for help, and others rejected this as humiliating, and the debate raged for days. Finally, they drafted a message, and the wording was carefully chosen to avoid sounding desperate, and they called it a request for limited advisory support in stabilizing regional challenges. The message was transmitted to Earth and received by Jennifer Cole, who was the new Secretary of Interstellar Relations, and sister to Martin, who had served with Ambassador Dixon. Jennifer read the message to the cabinet, which included General Richard Blake, who had been promoted to Defense Secretary after the withdrawal. Blake listened, and then stated firmly that humanity should decline, and Jennifer asked how they could stand by while people died. Blake said they could and must, because the galaxy needed to learn that actions had consequences, and that independence meant responsibility. Governor Rachel Torres protested and said it felt cruel, but Blake explained that if humans came running back at the first crisis, they would validate every claim that the aliens had been dependent. Senator Kevin Hart agreed reluctantly, and said it would get worse before it got better, and Blake nodded and said much worse. The reply was drafted and sent, and it was polite and sympathetic, but absolutely clear that humanity would not be returning. The message reached the Galactic Council and was read aloud, and the silence that followed was heavy with implications. Some delegates had expected humans to refuse, and felt it proved that humans were vindictive, but others realized that humans were simply letting the galaxy face the reality of its choice. The years that followed were difficult, and the pirate crisis deepened, and the economic contraction continued, and more conflicts erupted. General Krynn's fleet suffered devastating losses because Velkryn tactics had not evolved in 50 years, and every battle taught painful lessons. Krynn began to understand that military strength was not just about having ships, but about training and experience, and doctrine and adaptation, and the Velkryn had none of these. On Theros Prime, Veckan became the chief engineer, and every day was a struggle, and every failure reminded him of Peter Vaughn's patient teaching. He tried to contact Peter several times and sent messages asking for advice and offering to pay any price, but the messages were never answered. Peter received the messages but deleted them without reading because he had given everything to the Theros and they had rejected him, and he would not give more. The Qualeen-Zenithia War dragged on for 3 years and killed tens of thousands, and devastated border worlds, and finally ended in exhaustion rather than resolution. Council Leader Threevax tried to hold the Galactic Council together, but species began to withdraw and focus on their own problems, and the dream of galactic unity faded. Some species began to prosper in isolation and found ways to adapt, but most struggled, and the galaxy as a whole was poorer and more dangerous and more divided. On Earth, humanity focused inward and built new colonies in the Sol system, and developed new technologies and explored regions of space they had never had time to visit. General Blake established new military doctrines and trained a new generation of officers and prepared for an eventual return to the galaxy, but on humanity's terms. He told his officers that when humans went back, they would help those who valued partnership and ignore those who took it for granted. Admiral Nelson remained in his cabin in the wilderness and rarely spoke to anyone, but sometimes at night he stood outside and looked at the stars and whispered apologies to the people who had believed in his dream. The resentment grew slowly, like a disease that spreads through whispers and sidelong glances and quiet meetings in shadowed rooms where no humans were invited. Council Leader Threevax sat in the deepest chamber beneath the Velkryn capital and watched holographic recordings of human ships patrolling his people's space, and each ship felt like a reminder that the Velkryn were no longer masters of their own destiny. General Krynn stood beside him and pointed at the screens, and his voice was calm, but his words were like poison, and he spoke of dependence and weakness, and the loss of Velkryn identity. The general had spent months building alliances with military leaders from other species, and he had traveled to Theros and Qualeen and Dravkin, and everywhere he went, he found the same frustration and the same wounded pride. The Theros Collective held their own secret meetings, and their industrial leaders complained that human trade agreements always seemed to benefit human colonies first, and Theros mining worlds second, and they began to calculate how much wealth was flowing to human worlds, and the numbers made them angry. On Quilleen, the artists and musicians gathered in their great halls and mourned the loss of traditional forms, and young Quilleen no longer wanted to learn the ancient songs because they preferred human music, and the old masters felt their culture dying, and they blamed humanity for it. The Dravkin were warriors who had conquered 12 systems before the humans arrived and imposed peace, and the Dravkin military commanders remembered glory and expansion, and now they were constrained by treaties that humans enforced, and they dreamed of the days when Dravkin fleets struck fear into their enemies. All across the galaxy, the same conversations were happening, and the same resentments were building, and leaders who had once been grateful to humanity now spoke of occupation and control. Commander Richard Blake sat in his office on Mars Colony and studied the intelligence reports with growing alarm, and Major Lisa Campbell brought him new data every day, and each report was worse than the last. The alien species were conducting joint military exercises and forming economic blocs that excluded humanity, and holding diplomatic summits where human ambassadors were not invited, and Blake knew what this meant. He brought his findings to Admiral Nelson again, and this time he brought more evidence and more detailed analysis, and Nelson looked at it all and his face was troubled, but he still did not want to believe it. Nelson had given his life to building the galactic community, and he had friends among the alien leaders, and he had attended their ceremonies and celebrated their holidays, and he could not accept that they would turn against humanity after everything humans had done for them. Blake also spoke with Governor Rachel Torres, who administered the Mars colony, and she listened carefully and agreed that the situation was concerning, but she pointed out that humans had no contingency plans and no fallback positions, and if the galaxy did turn against them, humanity would be caught completely unprepared. Senator Kevin Hart represented the Outer Territories, and he was a pragmatist who understood politics, and when Blake briefed him on the situation, he immediately grasped the danger, and he began to quietly work with other senators to prepare evacuation protocols and resource stockpiles. But the majority of humanity remained unaware, and human families lived on alien worlds, and human workers maintained alien infrastructure, and human teachers educated alien children, and none of them suspected that anything was wrong. On Theros Prime, Peter Vaughn worked 16-hour days training the next generation of Theros engineers, and his student Vekan was brilliant and dedicated, and Peter was proud of how much he had learned. Vekan was struggling with guilt because he knew what was coming, and he had known for 3 months, but he could not bring himself to warn Peter because his loyalty to his own species was stronger than his friendship with his mentor. The Theros. Elders had told Vekan that humanity would be asked to leave, and that Theros would need engineers who understood the systems that Peter had built, and Vekan had been selected as one of those engineers, and he was honored, but also ashamed. Peter noticed that Vekan seemed distracted lately, but he assumed the young Theros was worried about his final examinations, and Peter tried to be encouraging and supportive, and never suspected the truth. Ambassador Claire Dixon continued her work, mediating disputes and building bridges between species, and she noticed that some alien diplomats were avoiding her, but she attributed it to normal political cycles and changing priorities. Claire had spent 30 years in diplomatic service, and she believed deeply in the galactic community, and she had faith that the bonds between species were strong enough to weather any storm. Dr. Gregory Walsh saw patients every day at his medical center, and he trained doctors and nurses from 7 species, and he shared knowledge freely, and he never imagined that his students were already planning how they would run the center after he was gone. Captain Vincent Cross maintained the defense network, and Lieutenant Karen Mills coordinated fleet movements, and together they kept the peace and stopped pirates and rescued colonies in distress, and they believed they were building something that would last forever. But in the council chambers and military headquarters and economic ministries of the alien worlds, the final preparations were being made. General Kryn had convinced enough leaders that it was time to act, and Council Leader Threvax had reluctantly agreed to call for a vote, and the Galactic Council set a date for a special session on Xenithi. The official agenda said the session would discuss trade regulations and defense spending, but the real purpose was hidden, and only the alien delegates knew what was truly going to happen. Human intelligence detected the unusual meeting, but Blake's analyst could not determine its true purpose, and Admiral Nelson decided to send Ambassador Dixon and her deputy, Martin Cole, to attend as observers. Dixon was pleased to be invited because she thought it meant the alien species were ready to include humanity more fully in their decision-making processes, and she prepared briefing materials and policy proposals. Martin Cole was younger and more cautious, and he had a bad feeling about the meeting, but he kept his concerns to himself because he did not want to seem paranoid or distrustful. The date of the council session approached, and human ships carried Ambassador Dixon to Zenith, and across the galaxy, human families went about their daily lives, and human workers performed their jobs, and nobody suspected that everything was about to change. On Earth, Admiral Nelson met with his senior staff and reviewed the fleet deployment, and everything seemed normal and routine. And he went home that evening and had dinner with his wife and talked about their plans to retire to a cabin in Canada. Commander Blake did not sleep well, and he lay awake thinking about the intelligence reports and the patterns he had seen, and he had a feeling that something terrible was coming, but he had no proof and no way to stop it. In the deep chambers beneath, Velcrin Prime Council Leader 3vax practiced his speech and chose each word carefully, and he knew that what he was about to do would change the galaxy forever, and he tried to convince himself it was the right choice. General Kryn felt no such doubts, and he was confident that the Velcrin and other species would be stronger without human interference, and he looked forward to the day when Velcrin ships would patrol Velcrin space without human oversight. On Theros, Prime Veckan finally decided to warn Peter, but when he arrived at Peter's quarters he found his mentor sleeping peacefully, and Veckan stood in the doorway for a long time, and then turned and walked away without waking him. The morning of the council session arrived, and delegates from every species gathered in the great amphitheater on Zenith, and Ambassador Claire Dixon took her seat and smiled at the alien diplomats around her, and prepared to take notes. Martin Cole sat beside her and scanned the room and noticed that the alien delegates were not meeting his eyes, and his sense of unease grew stronger. Council Leader 3vax walked to the central podium, and the amphitheater fell silent, and he began to speak. Council Leader 3vax's voice filled the amphitheater, and every word was chosen to cut and to convince and to justify what was about to happen. He spoke of gratitude first, and acknowledged everything humanity had done, and listed the achievements and the benefits and the peace that humans had brought, and Ambassador Claire Dixon nodded along, because she thought this was leading to some new partnership or deeper cooperation. But then 3vax's tone shifted, and he began to speak of dependence and loss of identity, and the price that had been paid for human protection. He talked about Velcrin children who spoke human languages better than their own, and Theros workers who could not operate mines without human supervision, and Qualine artists who had abandoned traditional forms to copy human styles. He spoke of economic systems that favored human colonies and military fleets that answered to human commanders, and diplomatic processes that required human approval, and with each point, his voice grew stronger. Ambassador Dixon felt her stomach tighten, and she looked at Martin Cole and saw her own fear reflected in his eyes. 3vax continued, and his speech lasted 2 hours, and he covered every grievance and every resentment that had built up over the decades, and he made it sound reasonable and necessary and just. He never called humans oppressors, and he never claimed they had acted with evil intent, and he praised their goodness and their generosity. But he said that generosity had become a cage, and protection had become control. The alien delegates listened and nodded, and many had tears in their eyes because they believed every word, and they felt righteous in what they were about to do. When 3vax finally finished, he called for the vote, and Ambassador Dixon stood and asked to speak. The chamber grew silent, and all eyes turned to her, and she walked to the podium with her head high, and her voice steady even though her hands were shaking. Claire spoke of partnership and shared sacrifice and the bonds that had been built over decades of working together, and she reminded them of disasters prevented and lives saved and prosperity that had been created through cooperation. She asked them to name one treaty that had been forced upon them, or one agreement that had been made without consent, or one time when humanity had acted against their interests. She spoke for an hour, and her words were eloquent and passionate, and filled with genuine hurt, because she had believed in the galactic community and had given her life to building it. When she finished, there was silence, and some delegates looked uncomfortable, and a few seemed to be reconsidering. But then General Kryn stood and spoke, and his words were like ice water on any doubts. The general talked about strength and independence and the future, and he said that gratitude should not mean eternal dependence, and that respect for what humans had done should not prevent species from finding their own path. The vote was called and the results appeared on the central display, and Ambassador Dixon watched the numbers climb and felt something break inside her. 83% in favor of the expulsion directive, and humanity was given one standard: year to withdraw all military forces and close all bases, and evacuate all civilians from non-human worlds and dissolve all administrative roles within the galactic government. Martin Cole grabbed Claire's arm to steady her, and they walked out of the amphitheater together, and behind them the alien delegates were already celebrating their independence. The news reached Earth within hours, and Admiral Nelson was in a meeting, when his aide burst in and handed him the report, and Nelson read it 3 times because he could not believe what he was seeing. Commander Blake heard the news and felt no surprise, only a deep sadness because he had known this was coming. But knowing did not make it hurt less. Across human colonies and outposts and ships, the word spread, and people reacted with shock and anger and disbelief and grief. Captain Vincent Cross received the order to begin withdrawal operations, and he stood on the bridge of his station and looked out at the stars, and Lieutenant Karen Mills was crying beside him, and the alien officers who served on the station could not meet their eyes. Cross asked if they were really just going to leave, and Mills asked how they could abandon everything they had built, and Cross had no answer because the treaty was clear, and the vote was legal, and humanity had no choice. On Theros Prime, Peter. Vaughn was working in the main control room when the news came through, and he stopped what he was doing and stood very still for a long moment. Veckan approached him carefully and tried to explain and apologize and tell him that it was not personal, and that the Theros people were grateful, but needed to be independent. Peter looked at his student and saw the guilt and the shame and the conviction all mixed together, and he nodded slowly. He asked Veckan if he understood how to maintain the systems, and Veckan said he did, and Peter asked if he was sure, and Veckan hesitated, and then said yes. Peter spent the next week writing detailed manuals and creating video tutorials and explaining every system in exhaustive detail, because even though he was hurt and angry, he could not bring himself to leave the Theros unprepared. Dr. Gregory Walsh closed his medical center on Qualine, and his students threw him a farewell ceremony and sang traditional songs, and many wept openly, and Walsh maintained his composure until he was alone in his quarters, and then he broke down. All across the galaxy, human families began packing their belongings and saying goodbye to alien friends and neighbors and co-workers, and the goodbyes were painful because many of the friendships had been real and deep. Some aliens tried to convince humans to stay, and said they could remain as private citizens without official roles, but most humans declined because they understood that their presence would only make the transition harder. The withdrawal took 8 months, and it was the largest logistical operation in human history, and Admiral Nelson coordinated everything from Earth and worked himself to exhaustion. Millions of humans had to be moved, and years of equipment and supplies had to be packed or transferred, and bases had to be decommissioned, and systems had to be handed over to alien authorities. Captain Cross oversaw the shutdown of the orbital defense network, and each station was carefully transferred to galactic control, and Cross personally trained the alien officers who would take over. He walked them through the power distribution, protocols, and the weapon systems and the communication networks, and he could see they did not fully understand, but they were too proud to admit it. Cross asked the Velcrin officer if he was sure he understood, and the officer stiffened and said they did not need human instruction anymore, and Cross bit back his response because it would not help. Human engineers transferred control of the trade, network and medical centers and mining operations and agricultural systems, and in every case they left detailed documentation and offered training. But many alien workers were more interested in asserting their independence than learning the details. Ambassador Claire Dixon stayed until the very last embassy was closed, and she met with Council Leader Threevax one final time. Threevax looked older and tired, and he thanked her for everything humanity had done, and said he hoped they would understand. Claire simply said she hoped the galaxy found what it was looking for, and Threevax nodded and said he hoped so too. but there was doubt in his eyes. The last human ship prepared to leave galactic space, and Commander Richard Blake volunteered to pilot it himself because he wanted to be the one to close this chapter. Blake's ship was a small survey vessel that had been mapping asteroids in the outer rim, and as he crossed the boundary into human-only space, he looked back at the galaxy they were leaving behind. He whispered good luck to the stars and added that they were going to need it. Back on Earth, the returned population struggled to adjust, and there were too many people, and not enough jobs and too many memories of lives left behind. Entire new colonies had to be established in the Sol system to handle the influx, and economic planners worked frantically to absorb millions of workers who had been performing specialized roles in the galactic economy. Admiral Nelson retired the day after the last ship returned, and he moved to a remote cabin in the Canadian wilderness, and refused all interview requests and all public appearances. The man who had dedicated 40 years to building galactic unity could not bear to discuss its failure, and he spent his days walking in the woods and trying to forget. But some humans like Commander Blake began to prepare for what would come next, because Blake had seen the intelligence reports, and he knew what happened to complex systems when critical components were suddenly removed. He knew the galaxy would suffer, and he knew they would regret their choice, and he knew that eventually they would ask for help. And he was already deciding what humanity's answer would be. The galaxy was broken when humans first arrived, and nobody expected them to fix it. But that is exactly what they did. Lieutenant Commander Daniel Hayes stood on the bridge of the Horizons Call and looked at the alien world ahead, and his hands were steady even though his heart was racing, because this was the moment that would change everything. And he knew it, but he did not know how much. The Velcrin were the first species to meet humanity, and they came with weapons ready and shields up. Because that is what everyone did in this galaxy, where trust was a word without meaning, and cooperation was a dream that died centuries ago. But Daniel did not raise his weapons, and he did not power his shields, and instead he opened a channel and said hello. The Velcrin commander was confused and suspicious and demanded to know what humans wanted, and Daniel smiled and said they wanted to be friends. And the Velcrin commander laughed, because friends was not a word used between species in this galaxy. But Daniel was patient, and he waited. Dr. Helen Carter was the chief science officer, and she prepared the data packages that would show the Velcrin what humanity could offer. And these were not weapons or threats, but solutions to problems the Velcrin had struggled with for generations. And when she transmitted the information, the Velcrin scientists could not believe what they were seeing. Energy distribution systems that could power entire cities with half the resources, and medical techniques that could cure diseases that had plagued them for centuries, and agricultural methods that could feed twice as many people with the same land, and all of this was offered freely without demands or conditions. Marcus Webb was the security chief, and he was a soldier who had seen combat, but he understood that strength was not just about fighting. And when the Velcrin asked about human military capabilities, he did not boast or threaten, and instead he offered to help them fight the pirates that raided their outer colonies, and the Velcrin were skeptical, but they agreed to let him try. The first joint operation happened 3 weeks later, and Marcus led a small team alongside Velcrin soldiers, and they tracked a pirate base to an asteroid field, and Marcus showed them tactics they had never considered and ways of moving and communicating that were more efficient. And when the battle was over, the pirates were captured and not a single Velcrin soldier was hurt, and they looked at Marcus with new respect. Within a year, the Velcrin signed a friendship treaty with humanity, and within 5 years, 3 more species had done the same, and the galaxy began to change in ways nobody had imagined possible. The Theros were miners who had dug into their planets for centuries, but their methods were old and dangerous, and many died in cave-ins and equipment failures, and they were proud people who did not ask for help. But when Peter Vaughn arrived and watched them work for a week, he quietly started drawing up plans. Peter was an engineer who loved solving problems, and he saw dozens of them in the Theros mines, and he approached their foreman and asked if he could show them something, and the foreman was annoyed but agreed, and Peter spent 6 hours explaining a new support system that would make the mines safer and more productive. The foreman was doubtful, but he let Peter install the system in one small mine as a test, and within a month, that mine was producing 4 times as much as the others and had 0 accidents, and the Theros called Peter a genius and begged him to help them redesign all their operations. Ambassador Claire Dixon was a woman who understood people, and when the Qualine and Zenithi came to her with their centuries-old border dispute, she did not pick a side. and she did not force a solution, and instead she listened for weeks and asked questions, and found the real issues beneath the anger. The border itself was not the problem, and both sides knew it, but neither would admit it. And Claire discovered that the real issue was water rights on 3 shared moons, and once she understood this, she brought in human hydrologists who designed a system that could provide enough water for both species, and suddenly the border dispute did not matter anymore. Dr. Gregory Walsh opened the first interspecies medical center on Qualeen, and he trained doctors from 7 different species and taught them techniques that humans had developed, and he also learned from them because each species had their own medical knowledge, and together they created treatments that no single species could have developed alone. Within 50 years, humanity had become essential to galactic civilization, and nobody questioned it because the benefits were obvious and overwhelming. Captain Vincent Cross commanded the defense network from an orbital station above Velcrin Prime, and his job was to keep the peace across 40 star systems, and he had 200 human ships under his command, and they patrolled constantly and stopped conflicts before they started. Lieutenant Karen Mills was his tactical officer, and she coordinated the fleet movements with precision and efficiency, and she knew the location of every ship at every moment, and when pirates tried to raid a Theros mining convoy, she had 3 ships there within minutes, and the pirates fled without firing a shot. The Galactic Trade Network was designed by Alan Booker, who was an economist that saw patterns others missed, and he created a system that connected every species and every world, and allowed trade to flow freely and fairly. And within a decade, the economy of the entire galaxy had grown by 300%. Humanity asked for very little in return, and they took a small tax to maintain their ships and pay their people. And they asked for the freedom to explore the empty regions of space, and every species agreed because it seemed like a small price to pay for peace and prosperity. Children of every species grew up learning human languages and human methods and human ways of thinking, and it seemed natural because humanity had proven themselves to be wise and kind and generous. But not everyone was happy. In the deep council, chambers of the Velcrin homeworld, there were whispers and quiet meetings, and Council Leader Threvax listened to his military advisor General Kryn speak about independence and strength and pride. General Kryn was a soldier who remembered when the Velcrin were warriors, and he did not like that his people now depended on humans for protection, and he began to speak with leaders from other species, and he found that many of them shared his concerns. The Theros felt that human trade agreements favored some worlds over others, and the Qualeen worried that their ancient art forms were being forgotten as young people preferred human entertainment, and the Dravkan military was frustrated by peace, treaties that limited their expansion, and all of these small resentments began to grow. On Earth, Commander Richard Blake read intelligence reports and saw patterns forming, and he brought his concerns to Major Lisa Campbell, who was his intelligence chief, and together they analyzed the data, and what they found worried them deeply. The alien species were coordinating and having meetings that excluded human representatives, and forming economic partnerships that deliberately avoided human worlds, and conducting military exercises together, without inviting human observers. Blake took this information to Admiral Frank Nelson, who commanded the entire human fleet, and Nelson was a man who had spent 40 years building relationships with alien governments, and he refused to believe they would betray humanity. Nelson had been there at first contact, and he had negotiated the first treaties, and he had friends among the Velcrin and Theros and Qualeen, and he trusted them, and he told Blake that the aliens were simply asserting their independence, and that it was healthy and natural, but Blake was not convinced, and he began to make quiet preparations because he had a feeling that something was coming, and he wanted humanity to be ready. Peter Vaughn continued his work on Theros Prime and trained young Theros engineers, and one of them was named Vekan, who was like a son to him, and Peter taught him everything he knew and never noticed the guilt in Vekan's eyes when they spoke about the future. 10 years passed, and the galaxy continued to decline, and the problems multiplied and compounded and spread. The pirate clans grew stronger and bolder, and they no longer just raided convoys, but began to conquer small colonies and establish their own territories. The Velcrin military fought them constantly, but every victory was costly, and General Kryn watched his fleet shrink as ships were destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Kryn was now an old man, and he spent his nights reviewing casualty reports and wondering how many of those deaths were his fault. He remembered standing in the council chamber and arguing for human expulsion, and he remembered feeling strong and righteous, and he wished he could go back and tell his younger self what a fool he was being. On Theros Prime, the mining operations stabilized at about 40% of what they had been under human management, and the Theros economy adapted to permanent recession. Veckan had become skilled at maintaining the systems, but he could not innovate or improve them, and he knew the mines would never be as productive as they had been when Peter ran them. He had stopped trying to contact Peter years ago, but sometimes he dreamed of his old mentor and woke up feeling ashamed. The Qualine and Xenithi established an uneasy peace, but the border remained militarized and both species diverted enormous resources to defense spending. The art and music that had flourished during the human era declined because artists struggled to survive in the new economy, and the great cultural centers became half-empty. The galactic trade network fragmented into regional systems, and trade between distant species became rare and expensive. Species that had been partners began to see each other as competitors, and old prejudices resurfaced, and xenophobia increased. The Galactic Council still met, but its authority was weak and its decisions were often ignored, and Council Leader Threevax presided over a shadow of what had once been. Threevax knew that history would remember him as the leader who destroyed galactic unity, and the knowledge weighed on him like a physical burden. He drafted a second message to Earth, and this one was different from the first. There were no requests for assistance and no diplomatic language and no attempts to save face. The message was simple and honest, and it said that the galaxy had been wrong and that they had not understood what they had until it was gone. Threevax wrote that they had mistaken cooperation for domination and partnership for control, and that they had been fools. He said they did not ask for humanity to return, and did not expect forgiveness, and only wanted humans to know that they understood now what they had thrown away. The message was broadcast across all human worlds, and people gathered in public squares to hear it read aloud. Some felt vindication, and others felt sadness, and many just felt tired. In his cabin in the Canadian wilderness, Admiral Nelson heard the broadcast on his old radio and sat in silence for a long time. He poured himself a drink and raised it to the stars and whispered that he forgave them, but could not save them. On Earth, General Richard Blake met with his inner circle in a secure conference room. Major Lisa Campbell, who had been his intelligence chief for 20 years, presented her analysis of the galactic situation. She explained that the galaxy was approaching complete systemic collapse, and that within 2 years the Galactic Council would likely dissolve entirely. Jennifer Cole asked if the alien species would survive, and Blake said they would eventually, but that it would take generations to rebuild. Governor Torres asked if they should just watch, and Blake said they should watch and remember and learn. He explained that humanity needed to understand that partnership only worked when both sides valued it equally. He said that when humans eventually returned to the galaxy, it would be on human terms, and they would help species who demonstrated genuine partnership and ignore those who took help for granted. Senator Hart asked how long it would be before humanity went back, and Blake said at least a century, and maybe longer. The room fell silent as they contemplated a future none of them would live to see. Blake pulled up a star map and showed them the regions humanity had been exploring during their decade of isolation. Humans had discovered 17 new habitable worlds and made contact with 3 minor species who had never been part of the galactic community. These species were less advanced but eager to learn and grateful for human assistance and their relationships with humanity were genuine partnerships built on mutual respect. Blake said this was the model for humanity's future, and that Earth would build a new community with species who valued cooperation. Jennifer asked what would happen to the old galactic community, and Blake said they would either figure out how to work together without human help, or they would fade into isolation. Far across the galaxy, Council Leader Threevax sat alone in the great amphitheater on Xenithi. The chamber that had once been filled with delegates from every species now stood mostly empty. A few representatives still attended sessions, but many species had withdrawn entirely and focused on their own survival. Threevax thought about the vote that had expelled humanity and how 83% had voted in favor. Every single one of those delegates now regretted it, and many had publicly apologized, and some had resigned in shame. But regret could not undo what had been done, and apologies could not bring humanity back. Thrivax had learned that wisdom without humility was worthless and that pride was the most expensive luxury a civilization could afford. He stood and walked slowly out of the amphitheater, and as he left, he turned off the lights. The chamber fell into darkness, and it seemed fitting because darkness had fallen across the entire galaxy. General Kryn died in battle against pirates defending a Velcrin colony, and his last thoughts were of the human soldiers who had once fought beside him. Veccan finally succeeded in making a minor improvement to the Theros mining systems and felt a moment of pride before realizing it was something Peter could have done in an afternoon. The Qualine and Zenithii signed a permanent peace treaty, but it came too late to save the thousands who had died in a war that should never have happened. On Earth, humanity continued to grow and prosper and build and explore, and they did not forget the galaxy they had left behind, but they did not dwell on it either. New generations grew up hearing stories of the galactic community and the great betrayal, and they learned the lessons their parents had paid so dearly to understand. Human children were taught that helping others was noble, but that sacrifice required appreciation, and that generosity could not be one-sided. They learned that strength was not just military power, but also the ability to walk away from those who did not value you. They learned that sometimes the kindest thing you could do for someone was to let them face the consequences of their choices. Admiral Nelson died peacefully in his sleep at age 97 and was buried in a simple grave overlooking a lake. At his funeral, General Blake gave a short eulogy and said that Nelson had believed in a dream that was beautiful, even if it had failed. Blake said that humanity would dream again, but next time they would dream with their eyes open. Years continued to pass and the galaxy continued to struggle, and humanity continued to grow stronger. Messages still came occasionally from alien governments, asking for help or offering apologies, but each one was politely declined. General Blake retired and handed command to a new generation of leaders who had never known the galactic community. These young leaders were pragmatic and cautious, and they understood that humanity's greatest strength was its ability to stand alone. On a distant world, a young human diplomat named Paul Gardner made first contact with a new species called the Ventari. The Ventari were curious and humble and eager to learn, and they treated humans as equals and partners. Gardner smiled as he shook hands with the Ventari ambassador and thought that maybe humanity was ready to start building something new, but that was a story for another time. The silence that fell when humans left the old galaxy was absolute, and it echoed across the stars. It was the sound of opportunities lost and relationships broken and wisdom learned too late. It was the sound of an entire civilization realizing that some things once broken cannot be repaired. And in that silence, every species heard the same truth. They had been offered something precious and rare, and they had thrown it away. And now in the darkness and the quiet, they finally understood what they had lost. But understanding came too late, and the stars themselves seemed dimmer for it.